Welcome to the Overflow Worship Podcast, where we want you to thrive in the ministry God has called you to. We truly believe that God's placement has purpose, and we're here for you with encouragement and tools for the journey.
Welcome, everybody, to the Overflow Worship Podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Olson. Thanks so much for joining us again this week as we talk about leadership principles. You know, if you've been along this journey with us so far, it's been a lot about leadership and a lot about just how to be a better leader, whether it's in worship or in your own life. And a couple of months ago, I had a special guest who's very close to my heart, Jeff Huston, who is also my dad. And we had a great conversation about leadership principles. We talked about the importance of defining and having clarity within your ministry, within your worship ministry, or just really in life in general. My dad has a lot of experience, and we talked about this in the past episode that we and the interview that we had, but he's got a lot of experience with training, leaders and just kind of coming alongside of those in church ministry, but also in business as well. And so I'm excited to kind of continue this conversation today. So welcome again, Dad, to the Overflow Worship Podcast.
Thank you, Andrea. It's great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. So people, if you want to learn more about my dad and kind of hear his background story, you can go back and listen to the previous episode that we had back in June, but we're just going to dive right in. So kind of where we left off was leadership principles. And my dad was a worship leader for a lot of years, and we were just having a really interesting conversation before we hit record on the podcast about his perspective now that he's stepped off the platform and stepped into a different season of, training leaders and kind of being in that role. And so I just want to ask you this question, Dad. What are your observations of your worship leader self, or just kind of some things as you reflect back and think about what God brought you through and what he taught you? Tell us a little bit about what you observe now that you're off the platform, maybe some perspective that you've gained since then.
That's good, Andrea. So I think it's important for your listeners to know that it was an intentional, really calling for me to go off the platform. And God called me to be more focused in a leadership role within the context of the overall ministry. And that meant that I needed to say no to something. I loved leading worship. And I would say to this day, it is still, I still miss it. And which is interesting because I didn't realize that was the case. When you're in the middle of the hustle and bustle of having to prepare every week for it. I mean, we all know that it's not a show, right? We all know that. But the reality is that, when Sunday is done, you wake up Monday morning and you got to get ready to do it all over again, right? You got to get in that mindset because practice is coming, and we got to get the words, the sequences and the transitions and all of that stuff. Yes. And we got to do that every week, week after week. And so I think that when you're in the middle of it, you don't really have a chance to step away and treasure the blessing of being allowed to, or being called to be on the platform and leading people in worship. The worship leader, as I have worked now, specifically over the last 10 years in leadership with lots of different roles and staff members within the context of the local body. What I will say, to this day, I believe that the worship leader's role is the most challenging role in the entire church organization. And I don't know that we would have time in this podcast to unpack all of that, but there are so many dimensions that the worship leader has to deal with. I mean, even just some of the, just a real tactical thing, like you have how to take people that want to be involved or have an expectation of being involved in the ministry, and maybe they don't have the gifting within their craft vocally or instrumentally, and how do you love them and yet direct them accordingly within. I mean, that's just one little microcosm of, hey, it's people, and it's a very challenging thing. So the worship person's role is a very challenging and stretching and role. And at the same time, so when you're in the middle of it, I think the tendency would be is to miss the blessing of it, right? When we were raising you girls, someone told us a long time ago that the days go by slow, but the years go by fast. And how true that is, right? When you're raising kids, it's kind of that way in worship ministry also. I think that the days can go by slow, or if in the sense the experience can go by slow, seems like it drags on and on and on. But in retrospect, wow, what a blessing it is to be able to be a reflector. And that kind of leads me to maybe a different train of thought. I always viewed myself when I was on the platform as a reflector. I wasn't the light. I was only a reflector of the light. And if you think about the physical reality of a reflector, is like if you stick a reflector out in your yard and there's no light, it's just in the dark. It's just black, right? You can't see it. You can't see anything. It isn't until your headlights shine on it that or there's some light that shines on it that you actually see and it reflects. And I think it was always a good posture for me to be as a worship leader, to see myself as a reflector and to consciously, continually remind myself that I'm not the light, right? Because we can get, when we're up on the platform, we can get in this mindset about, I missed this note, or, I missed this transition, or this didn't go well, or the mic squeaked, when it shouldn't have. What is that sound guy? I wish he would do a better job. I mean, we can get so into the tactical part of it that we miss the fact that, dude, you're not the light, right? You're just the reflector of the light. And so that's kind of one aspect that of it. And then the other is, I remember, and I'm sure your listeners have this happen frequently, where you get done with a service and somebody comes up to you and says, "Oh, thank you so much. It was so great. I just really appreciate. You're." Not that they're saying you're awesome, but it's kind of like, okay, what do I do with this compliment? Right. Praise God. Isn't God great? And thank you. It's like there's a little bit of an awkwardness when that happens. And so how I got in the mindset of viewing that was like the flower delivery person. Okay, so, if I order a bouquet of flowers, or somebody orders a bouquet of flowers and I'm the delivery guy, right? I get to enjoy the flowers, right? I can enjoy, they're in my car, I can smell them, and, I can look at them and wow, isn't that nice? But they're not my flowers. And I think it's that way, is that you can, out of respect and courtesy for the person that is giving the compliment, you receive it, you say thank you, but look at yourself like the delivery. They just gave you a rose, and you get to enjoy the rose for just a moment, but then consciously, intentionally, you actually give that. You have to give that rose. I mean, don't take the rose home with you, and don't put it on the, in a vase and put it on your mantle and play it over again. And, the next day and the next day. Wow. That don't do that, because the rose wasn't for you. It was for, it was for somebody else. It was for our King. And so just to see myself as a reflector and as a flower delivery person, those would be two things. And then kind of wrapping the wrap around that is, don't miss the blessing
Yeah.
of being able to be called to be in a worship ministry. It is truly a unique gift, and it is a great pleasure. Do not take it for granted.
Hmm. I love that. And I think it's such great perspective for all of us in life and leadership, and for all of you who are listening out there. I mean, this applies whether you're a worship leader or a pastor or a leader in another capacity. I mean, you can pull things from this because it's just such valuable advice. And I think of, like, a lot of times we hear, so I'm a younger mom and I've got young kids, and we hear from, like you, my dad, and from other people whose kids are grown and gone, say, don't miss the blessing of this time. And I just draw that parallel because it kind of reminds me of that. Like you're saying, you've been in it, and, you did the mundane, you did the hard, you did all, the day to day to day, all of those things every single week after week after week. And I honestly, I mean, I don't remember you ever getting a break. Like, I'm just thinking through my mind because I grew up in your household and I don't remember, like, other than, maybe vacations here and there, but you guys were up there every single week. And so for you to have, that perspective now is just so valuable for us who are in it. And it's not something that, you as listeners out there, that we just should pass by, like, oh, thanks for that, but you don't get it. No, he gets it. He was in it. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing, to not miss the blessing of what we get to do. And that doesn't mean it's easy all the time and you walk around with, just this floaty perspective. It's really just that it's a real perspective of, like, wow, I get to do this. And I know it's going to be hard sometimes, but I want to keep that, that perspective. And then, along those lines, I want to ask you, how could we do that for those of us who are in worship ministry? How could we work to get that perspective? The words like that pop into my mind are like, oh, rest time or vacation or sabbatical or, those types of things. Well, maybe that's a good answer and you could expound on that. But I also know a lot of people that I personally work with, I don't know if sabbatical's on the table,
Right.
So like, what are some ways now that you have been out of it for a while, and like you said, intentionally, because God called you to step into something else? How can we do that? How can we find the time to gain perspective, to really keep our minds and our hearts in the right place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure that I have, certainly it's not an all-inclusive answer, but a few things come to mind. One would be, today I'm 58 years old, and I would say it's much easier for me to hear God speaking at this juncture in my spiritual journey. I believe that's mainly due to intentionally creating space in my life, instead of wearing the merit badge of busyness.
Oh my goodness! Yeah.
I've come to strongly believe in the power of doing less. There's a quote from Dr. Howard Hendricks that had said in a letter to his seminary alumni. In fact, as we're talking, I'm pulling it up. Because it has so powerful for me. He said, and I quote, that's Dr. Howard Hendricks in a letter to his seminary alumni, quote, "If anything has kept me on track all these years, it's being skewed to this principle of central focus. There are many things I can do, but I have to narrow it down to the one thing I must do." He finishes by saying the secret of concentration is elimination, end quote. So, I continually work to narrow down my areas of responsibility to those few things where God can use me to add the most value. And this is a deep subject, but part of it is we we tend to, I was raised that in an environment where busyness and productivity were rewarded, right? Hey, good job. How you doing? I'm busy. Hey, that's great. Good to be busy. Yeah. And and so my self-worth and value were really wrapped up in how busy I was and what I was doing, right? And what God has taught me is that doing is good, but being is also good. And I got really good at doing, but I wasn't very good at being. And so, there's no magic switch that you can flip or book that you can read that will say, okay, you know what, I'm going to be really good at being. The only way to do that is you got to get it. You have to intentionally pursue that. And so, but here's the thing. It's really hard in the context of church and ministry. It's really hard to say no to something.
Right.
Why? Because it's all good ministry, right? Yeah. I mean, there's not bad ministry. I suppose there could be something that would be bad out there, but I can't think of it. It's all good ministry. Right. And, when we're dealing in the area of budgets and that type of thing, we always go back to in Stephen Covey in his class, Jim Collins. Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great, said that the purpose of a budget is not to decide who gets how much. The purpose of a budget is to decide what part of the organization or what part of the ministry gets fully funded and what part doesn't. Right. So if you think of that, okay, that's in terms of budgets, but that's also in terms of our life. Right.
Yeah, that's so true.
See, the purpose of, like budgeting your time or looking at your time or expending your time or planning your time, however you want to say it. The purpose is not to decide who gets how much. It's like what part of my life is going to get fully funded and what part isn't. But it's really hard in ministry because it's all good ministry. And so I'm just circling back when, Dr. Hendricks says that if anything has kept me on track all these years, it's been skewed to this principle of central focus. There are many things I can do, but I have to narrow it down to the one thing I must do. The secret of concentration is elimination. So I think that a lot of people don't understand that about me. They can look and they say, well, there's so many parts of the ministry, Jeff, that you're not in. Why aren't you on the platform? Hey, I'd love to be in worship ministry, or I'd love to run sound, or I'd love to do words, or I really would.
Yeah.
But the secret of concentration is elimination. And when you continually work to narrow down your areas of responsibility, then I think God is more able to leverage and use us to add the most value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such an amazing perspective and so thought-provoking, thinking about, budgeting our time. And it's not a matter of like you get 2 minutes and this gets an hour and it's like, it's just a complete perspective shift. Even for me, I'm just thinking through my wheels in my brain are turning because I love that. And I think that's so valuable for us in ministry to think of it in terms of not the micro things, but the big picture and like what's going to get my time. So I just love that. And I love the perspective for us as leaders in worship ministry and churches, just to really think about that and think about being intentional, with our time and with our resources, just all of that. So I love that perspective, Dad. Thank you for sharing that.
Before we continue today's episode, we'd like to invite you to the Overflow Worship Conference on October 11th and 12th in Wilmer, Minnesota. This unique event is for worship leaders and their whole worship team. We focus on small and medium-sized churches and the unique challenges that they face. This year, join Meredith Andrews, Todd Fields, Jacob Suter, Andrea Olson, and more for a weekend of encouragement and growth. For more information, visit overflowworship.com.
Are there any things that you do, literally practically, like, well, every morning at 5:30 I do this, or I have an app on my phone that shoots me a Bible verse, or whatever, like really super practical. Is there anything that you do in your life now that you kind of wish you could have implemented when you were in the mundane of worship leading ministry?
I would say a couple things come to mind. One would be is that I used to strive to be a well-rounded leader, and I don't believe that is really a valid pursuit. Instead, discover the zone that, I continually am intentional about discovering the zone that God created me to be in. And then, if I can delegate it or I eliminate it, or, to me, there's a difference between being in charge versus in control. And, I'm in charge as a leader, but that doesn't mean I have to be in control of everything. I have to be willing to release things to other people. That's what being a leader is. And so I think from a practical standpoint, then how does that relate into what I do? Well, I feed my mind with those things. I'm listening to podcasts. I'm reading books. My my devotions, my prayer time. I mean, it really centers around pursuing excellence in those areas. And it's interesting that how when we focus on something, it becomes our reality. There's a saying that says that we all will become the sum total. So I will become the sum total of the 5 people that I spend the most time with. All right. Yeah. So then that begs the question, who am I spending my time with? Mm-hmm. Right. Or I would ask your podcast listeners, if you're going to become the sum total of the 5 people you spend the most time with, who are you becoming? Right? Who are you going to become? And, wow, that's kind of a convicting or a challenging thing. But the practical part of it is, what are you putting in? Right? Because what you put in is going to come out. It is my most favorite thing in the book. Well, the story of Solomon is fascinating to me, simply because he has, this proverbial one wish. God comes to him in a dream and says, "What do you want?" And he asked for wisdom, and I was so intrigued as a 12-year-old boy. I was so intrigued by reading that story for the first time, and I was just captivated by it. But so Solomon is he is credited with 3,000 proverbs, wise sayings that have been collected, and there's so much wisdom in so many of them. But then there's buried into the book of Proverbs, he says, he makes this state. He starts with this saying. He says, above all else. Well, wait a minute. This is a guy who had it all, did it all, experienced it all. Scripture says that there was no one like him before, and there won't be anyone like him again. He was unique in human history, right? He has all of this wisdom that God supernaturally granted him, and he begins by saying, above all else. You mean, really? Above everything? Yeah, above all else. Guard your heart, because it determines the direction of your life, right? And so my question from a very practical standpoint is, what are we doing to guard our hearts? What are we putting in? Because what we put in comes out. Who we spend time with comes out. And so that's not an app on a phone. but
Yeah.
it is a mindset, and it is a conscious decision to say, what am I becoming? When I was at a transition point in my business career, one portion was ending and a new one was beginning, and I really wanted to know what the next step was. And I prayed for a year for God to reveal to me what the next step was. And I just got silence. It's like, man, I'm begging God to show me the next step. And finally, a year into this, I heard clearly. And what he said is, Jeff, I'm less interested in what you do. I'm infinitely interested in what you become. So the question for our listeners is, what are you becoming? Mm-hmm. What are you becoming? You know what I did, just as a real practical thing, that was so impactful to me. I took and I made a list of things that I wanted to become. So what did I want to become in my life? What were I want to become more godly. I want to become more Christ-like. I want to be a better husband. I made a list of all these things and of what I want to become. What are the characteristics that I want to become as a person? And then I filtered opportunities through that grid, right? Rather than taking a grid and filter, taking the opportunity and filtering it. No. Yep. Turn it around. Right?
Yeah, it's like a filter.
Filter opportunities through what you want to become, because God is more interested in what we become than he is in what we do.
Wow. That is so powerful. And you know what? I think that is just a perfect place to wrap up our conversation and just leave that with our listeners. Guys, it's so important. God cares so much about you and your heart and who you become. And he has so many things ahead for each one of you that, you don't even know about yet. He's still writing your story. He cares so much that he's more interested in who you're becoming and not what you're doing. And so for you, all of those things that you work so hard at, I know you work hard at details and song set lists and transitions and all of that. And we talk a lot about those practical things on the podcast because they're necessary and we want to help you in that way, but it's got to start here. This is like the overarching big filter that you run all of those decisions through. I tell you what, if you look at things through this lens, even your song transitions are going to be affected. Everything's affected. So I love that. And I thank you so much, Dad, for sharing that with us, because I think it's just going to be a huge blessing and impactful to our listeners. So thank you for opening up your heart and sharing that with us today.
Thank you for listening to the Overflow Worship Podcast. To stay up to date, please subscribe for the latest episodes and information. To learn more about the ministry of Overflow, visit overflowworship.com. If you have questions or prayer requests, we would love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@overflowworship.com.